Due parole di introduzione sulle vignette che qualcuno di voi ha visto entrando in sala. Possiamo partire con la prima diapositiva. Oggi in fondo è il 1° aprile, quindi festeggiamo Darwin attraverso la conferenza del professor Kohn in maniera anche ironica. Questo è un libro degli anni 70, la prossima, che illustra la teoria evolutiva attraverso anche delle vignette. Più che teoria evolutiva io parlerei di trasformazione. Un uomo che diventa pian piano un bue. Alla prossima. Le vignette del Punch, ognuno sa, sono le più simpatiche che sono state proposte sulla teoria darwiniana, prevalentemente subito dopo l'origine delle specie e dopo The Descent of Man, l'origine dell'uomo. Vignette che riguardano anche dei malintesi, l'origine presunta dell'uomo dalla scimmia. In realtà Darwin propone una teoria diversa nell'origine dell'uomo che riguarda la scimmia. Alla prossima. Un'altra vignetta del Punch che poi potete vedere in originale sotto il palco, che richiama la somiglianza dell'uomo con il gorilla. È un gioco di parole. La prossima. Delle vignette del Punch sono interessanti perché illustrano anche altri malintesi della teoria evolutiva. Questa è una vignetta poco nota. Nella facciata dietro questa parte, la prossima, possiamo vedere in fondo un abbozzo di quella che probabilmente è la vignetta più famosa del Punch. Questa è una vignetta interessante nella quale si parla di un convegno di quadrupedi, quindi di scimmie. C'è un'idea di un tempo ciclico e anche qui di nuovo il malinteso dell'uomo che deriva dalla scimmia. E poi c'è in basso a destra il malinteso più diffuso che riguarda tuttora la teoria evolutiva, l'assenza di anelli di collegamento, anelli intermedi. Tuttora i creazionisti si fondano su questo fatto per proporre un'idea diversa da quella evolutiva darwiniana e della biologia moderna. Se voi osservate questa diapositiva e poi quella successiva, possiamo andare quindi alla prossima. Arriviamo a quella che secondo me è la più famosa e la più nota vignetta del Punch, che richiama i malintesi della teoria evolutiva. Di nuovo l'uomo che discende dalla scimmia, c'è in questo caso Charles Darwin al centro dell'immagine, c'è l'indicazione del caos che dovrebbe intervenire nella teoria darwiniana per originare le novità, ammesso che poi Darwin abbia parlato solo di caso e non anche di leggi naturali, e poi c'è la didascalia man is but a worm, l'uomo non è altro che un verme, quindi in un certo senso un'origine animale dell'uomo. La prossima. Nello stesso periodo in Francia la comunità scientifica era prevalentemente attenta a trovare dei precursori francesi della teoria evolutiva darwiniana. Anche lì nascono delle vignette. Questa è una vignetta altrettanto famosa che potete vedere in originale sempre sotto il palco. È un albero della conoscenza tratta da La Lune Rose di André Gilles nell'agosto del 1878. La prossima. Questa è una cosa che non credo sia stata mai tradotta in italiano. Io ora ve la leggo. La prossima. Gli uomini illustri, Darwin. Molti non sanno chi sia Darwin. Senza l'accoltellatore Lebier, che si definiva darwiniano, forse non conoscereste nemmeno il suo nome. Ebbene, ecco di che si tratta. Darwin è uno scienziato inglese, un naturalista, uno sgobbone. Ha detto che l'uomo discende dalla scimmia. L'uomo è una scimmia trasformata, perfezionata, selezionata, come dice la gente istruita. Voi capite che questo infastidisce molto gli spacconi, che credono di aver partorito il meglio, e i pretonzoli lo vedete da qui il loro palmo di naso. Allora ecco quello che si sono inventati. Se Lebier ha trucidato la vedova Gillier per rapinarla, la colpa è di Darwin. Con questo ragionamento, se un assassino la sera prima di commettere un delitto avesse incartato 2 soldi di groviera in un foglio della Défense, Dupanloup sarebbe forse un suo complice? Banda di quadrumani mal selezionati che non sono altro. Andiamo avanti. Un'altra vignetta, questa ancora più bella, che purtroppo non sono riuscito a portare perché era di dimensioni abbastanza grandi, è stata pubblicata nello stesso anno, nel 78, quindi qualche anno dopo la pubblicazione dell'origine della specie, in un giornaletto analogo, la Lune Rose, sempre proposto da André Gilles. Avanti. Anche qui c'è un testo molto interessante che non posso leggervi per brevità, ma forse l'immagine più interessante è quella del Darwin che forse vorremmo vedere tutti quanti. Avanti. Anche qui di nuovo il tormentone dell'uomo che discende dalla scimmia. La prossima. Quel signore in alto a sinistra è un famoso positivista che in quello stesso periodo stava cercando, insieme ad altri evoluzionisti, di sottolineare l'opera darwiniana. Si parla di André Littré. La prossima, ecco l'immagine umoristica. André Littré è al centro e Darwin, come al solito in caricatura, Darwin e scimmia, salta. E devo dire, avanti la prossima, che in questa caricatura Darwin ha superato la credenza. Il successivo cerchio riguarda l'ignoranza. Noi conosciamo veramente poco di Darwin, nonostante sia stato ed è un personaggio importantissimo. Noi oggi abbiamo l'occasione e direi la piacevolezza di sentire uno dei più importanti storici della scienza, che da tanti decenni studia il pensiero darwiniano, è professore emerito alla Drew University, i suoi meriti sono tanti. Pensate che nell'82 ha pubblicato questo librone che è tuttora interessante e riguarda l'eredità darwiniana. Noi abbiamo anche in fondo un'eredità da difendere. Ha organizzato la pubblicazione recente dei taccuini di Darwin. Si è interessato a un'altra opera che è fondamentale in questo momento, quella di rendere disponibile per chiunque attraverso internet la corrispondenza di Darwin. Sapete tutti che Darwin era un incredibile scrittore, non passava giorno nel quale non proponeva delle lettere. È direi uno dei più importanti storici della scienza del pensiero darwiniano. Io lascio la parola, la mia è stata solo una introduzione, ora sentiamo il professor Kohn. Grazie.
Okay. Yes? I'm sorry, I apologize for not being able to speak to you in Italian, but I don't know Italian. It's, of course, This is our, no, I don't think I want to join that network. Excuse me. This is, of course, the 150th year anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species and the bicentenary of Darwin's birth. And I am really thrilled and privileged to be here with you in your very extensive celebration of the Darwin year that is going on in Rome and elsewhere in Italy. You know, back in 1982, Senor Narducci referred to this big fat book. This book came out of a conference which I had the honor of organizing here in Italy, in Florence. And now that was celebrating another anniversary because Darwin died in 1882. So somehow I've gone from Darwin's death back to Darwin's birth, which is a miracle of time travel, perhaps, but always happy to be here in Italy. Let me start with this very famous illustration from Darwin's Notebook B. I've noticed in this anniversary year that the way that Darwin has been portrayed reflects, as it would be natural, the influence of what is of current concern to the world of science, because Darwin belongs to all of culture. He's a major cultural figure, but he also belongs to science in particular. And in this period of time that we live in now, there is a great emphasis on the tree of life. And Darwin drew this in 1837. And why is that so important now? Obviously because of the studies with DNA and the genome projects. And the major changes in molecular systematics, the molecular systematics have brought about in our understanding of the tree, the actual relationship among organisms. But you know, I don't think, looking at this from the perspective that I have as a historian of science, that the tree is the whole story for Darwin. The concept of descent and branching is part of his story, and it's just wonderful that he could just dash this off. But there's more to the story. The other side, which perhaps we don't see so much of these days, besides the branching tree, is the question of adaptation, or really of natural selection. And what I'm going to be speaking about tonight, really this somewhat unknown, let's call it, not totally unknown, or unexpected Darwin, some unexpected aspects of Darwin's intellectual development, might be a more modest title, is the relationship between the tree and natural selection. This dialogue that goes on over a period of many, many decades for Darwin. Let me just say that there's nothing inherent in branching diagrams that explains adaptation. And so let's focus a little bit on adaptation. Here is that very same orchid. This is an orchid which grows on down bank that is right maybe 1.5 miles from Darwin's home. You know, the pyramidal orchid in English. And here's a butterfly. Lives there. This is an orchid that Darwin wrote about, and actually famously Federico Del Pino, the Italian Darwinist, also worked on orchids and was very much part of Darwin's circle. And may I just say, by the way, how wonderful your exhibit is, and how nice it is that you have included a large section, a reasonably large section on Darwin in Italy, because Italians were extremely important receivers, or I would say fellow travelers with Darwin. But here we have a wonderful example of adaptation. And of course, adaptation means the development by evolution of specializations that allow an organism to live in its environment. This butterfly, proboscis, goes into the flower, and it attaches these little objects are actually from the flower. It's the pollen, the male part of the orchid, that it pulls out. And actually, if you would see it coming out, they would be pointing more or less at this angle, at a kind of perpendicular to the proboscis. But they bend over, and when this butterfly flies to another flower, they are perfectly oriented to enter the flower and to fertilize it. That's adaptation. This special relationship in here between two organisms at different parts of the tree. You know, two organisms that are otherwise unrelated, but whose lives, in both reproductively and economically, if you like, are mutually interdependent. And the only explanation we have ever had of that, to this date, is natural selection, Darwin's concept of natural selection. So it would be interesting to see how that is, see the connection between the tree and natural selection. Okay, so we have this question of adaptation. Now, just to emphasize the story, of course, this is another trick I want to play on you. The Origin of Species, this is the name of Darwin's book. So you would expect that this book would be about the origin of new species. Now, modern scientists, up until very, very recently, have in fact owned Darwin in a way which has been maybe not so constructive, because they've led us to believe that natural selection was only about adaptation, not to Darwin. Notice the subtitle, which we almost never stop to read, and I apologize that it's somewhat out of focus, but it's, you know, the origin of species by means of natural selection, okay, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So it's about the making, if you accept that word, preservation of, and by races he just means varieties that are hereditary. We're not talking about racism here. He's talking about races of orchids, if anything. That's of key importance to him. It's a way of saying that the book is about the origin of species, and it's by natural selection, and it comes down to this preservation of varieties or races. So somehow that tree, which is about the branching, is connected to natural selection. And let's see how that works for Darwin. This brings us to this large issue in Darwin's intellectual development of speciation. Actually, he didn't have a single word called speciation, so I have to apologize. The only time I know that he used one single word, it was called specification. He might have said it in Italian, you know, specificazione. Maybe he did say it in Italian, I don't know. But in any case, to a modern understanding, speciation is how do you make new species? Now, really, Darwin has, in 1837, when he really first starts becoming, you know, formulating the theory of evolution, one theory of isolation, which we connect here with sort of the younger Darwin and the tree that we saw before. How do new species form? By geographic barriers, basically. If a population of animals or plants are separated from ancestors, they will go their separate ways, and that's how you would have branching. Along in the middle here, in this timeline, if you like, imagine in 1838 Darwin reads Malthus and discovers natural selection. And right from the beginning, it's about making of new forms, and he has a lot of synonyms, new forms, new varieties, new species, as much as it's about the origin of adaptation. towards the end of this, I'm pointing here, let's say this is the end of the period of Darwin's active writing of notebooks in 1839. He pretty much admits in his last notebook, e-notebook, I can't explain this. Why does the branching occur? What makes things occur? At least he cannot see the connection between natural selection and new species. It's like a big hole in Darwin's theory. You can explain isolation, okay, that's a quick way. That isolation has absolutely nothing to do with natural selection. You just separate, populations. Natural selection is about competition and struggle, as Darwin said. So there's a gap. Now, by 1857, he has a new way called the Principle of Divergence, and of integrating selection with the tree. And this is a diagram which is in the long version of The Origin. It's very similar to the one that was printed in the first edition of The Origin, in Principle. And we're going to look at it a little more closely. So how do you get from here to here? Say from Malthus to here. Well, first of all, I'm going to show you a few pictures before I answer that question, showing how truly obsessed Darwin was with trees, because it's not just that famous tree that we know and love. First of all, before he starts talking about the tree, a couple of pages earlier, he's got a coral. He actually calls this the coral of life. And Professor Bredekamp in Germany has suggested really all the trees are about really forms of coral branching, because Darwin knew about coral quite a lot. The only problem with that view is that Darwin calls them trees. He does call this a coral, but the rest of the things I'm going to show you he calls trees, as far as I know. And this is 1837. Over here we are in 1868, after The Origin, well after The Origin. And look at this. This is the primate tree. And look how detailed, man, and I can't even read from here, all these different simian, relations. I mean, maybe he was guilty. But Old World Monkey, he actually has a pretty detailed phylogeny. This is the most detailed branching tree with specific organisms attached to it ever that Darwin did, right? And the obsession, we can see this also here. These two are not dated, but I believe they're from, my view is that they're from the 1850s in his natural selection portfolios, while Darwin, over the years, before he starts to write The Origin, he doesn't really sit down to write until the late 1850s. He's keeping notes, and these are from those kind of notes. And you see in the 1850s, here we have one where it's really kind of very roughly sketched, and it's more or less the mammalian lineage, but no details. This is interesting because it gives you the perspective of time. What he's got here is geological epochs, Paleozoic, and Tertiary here. So if you look down on this, you're getting a three-dimensional view. Now that's kind of Coraline. Okay, that's fun. Actually, Professor Voss, between them, Professor Voss and Bredekamp have found, let's say, 9 trees in Darwin's notes. All these notes, of course, come from Cambridge University Library, where the major Darwin treasure trove is. And I'm going to show you a new one. And it takes 2 pages to show you this. And I'm going to read you a little Darwin manuscript. And look at the interesting date, December 48, in the middle. We have never seen before, no one's ever seen before, Darwin thinking about trees. He's thought to have given up. Actually, this comes from Darwin's barnacle period. And I trust you know what a barnacle is, a little animal that lives on the bottoms of boats, for example. Darwin wrote 2 gigantic books about barnacles. This is supposed to be the dark ages of Darwin, where he spends from 1846 to 1854 doing nothing but barnacles. And you know, the family, it's sort of a famous Darwin joke how the children go to their friend's house and they see the friend's parents doing things, and they say, one Darwin child says to one of his friends, "Where did your father do his barnacles?" Because this is all that Darwin was supposed to do, his barnacles. That's how they knew him. Year after year of careful anatomy, comparative anatomy, supposed to have nothing to do with really the heart of the theory of evolution. Well, not so fast. Actually, I think it was extremely important. If there's anything I'm going to be telling you tonight that is a different Darwin, is how very important the barnacles were in this important line of Darwin's intellectual development. He's saying here, in 1848, it's 2 years after he got started on the barnacles, I have been, this is a little bit hard for me, I have been much struck in Anatifera, that's a group of barnacles, a genus of barnacle, how the genus, and I have no doubt universal, as evidenced by subgenera, breaks up into little groups. As if he just sort of discovered this. And how's he discovering it? By looking at those Anatifera. Hence, those who use digestive character have generally, diagnostic character, have generally to refer to only one, crosses out, 2 or 3 species. So again, species, this is tough on this, break up into groups of varieties. I don't think I've ever done this. It's almost like reading upside down to read Darwin on an angle like that. He does have a lovely handwriting, I'll have to admit. And what's he saying? He jumps from this specific case of the Anatifera, breaking up into little groups, breaking up into little groups. And then immediately to the larger question of classification. How is it that the systematist, the classifier, can just with a few characters, 2 or 3 species, diagnose the genus? Yeah. So again, species break up into groups of varieties. So we have a relationship between species and varieties. Very strong notion that will come out in the origin. In the origin, he says the varieties are incipient species that are being born. That will be his metaphor. And we're going to have to get him from the metaphoric, which has gone really from the imageic, iconic metaphor to metaphors and words now, but still, we need to move Darwin or see if we can discover, I don't mean to say in any teleological sense, but would like you to understand the way in which he moves from these metaphors of little trees branching to incorporate natural selection. Okay, and actually, let's look at the next page of this very same, the reverse side of this page carries on. Genera, again, in same family, are united into little groups. So he's covered everything, varieties, species, genera. So throughout the animal kingdom, so children, even in same family. It is universal law. Breaking out. This is when Darwin's supposed to be not thinking about big things. And what does he do? A little doodle. He gives us a little tree. And I say this tree is as important as the very first tree, and all the others are kind of doodles. This one is Darwin, I am thinking hard about it. Now, what is it about those barnacles that gets him thinking? Okay, he is doing taxonomy. He's very carefully studying this group. It's a pretty big group of organisms. There are a lot of genera to be described. And he looks at them, at these specimens very carefully and works out their relationship, has a lot of trouble in making out what is a species and what is a variety. What should this genus be broken up into 5 or 6 different species or one? He talks about how he, once he had a group, actually it was the Anatifera, where he had it broken up into 6 different, had the genus broken up into 6 different species or 7 different species, ripped it apart, looking at it a month later, lumped it all into one. It comes back again, breaks it up into another 2, 3, or 4, rips it apart, does it over again. Very difficult to know what its species is, what is a variety. So he knows them by now very well. And now let me show you a picture of Darwin's best friend, Joseph Dalton Hooker, who in a way is a little bit of a demon in this story, this particular story. Hooker, of course, is really close to Darwin as an emotional friend. It takes him a long time to become an evolutionist, but he's the man that Darwin is testing his ideas on. And Hooker is the only scientist, the only person who could have done anything with the following piece of knowledge. He's the only scientist who knows about natural selection, the structure of the idea of Darwin's real, his real original idea, before the 1850s. In 1847, Darwin lets him see the essay that he has written and otherwise has put under the stairs to hide. During the period when he's not willing to publish. So Hooker says to him, it seems, from his reminiscences afterwards, and for things that Darwin say, it looks like they're talking back and forth around this idea that Hooker says, Chuck, or Charles, or Carlo, whatever he called him, probably just Charles, or Darwin, until you really study varieties and can define them, go through the agonies that I go through, because Hooker was a great systematist, a botanist, and becomes the director of Kew Botanic Garden, and does global taxonomic surveys, the whole flora of India, for example, or all of the southern hemisphere, away from Phrygia, from Tierra del Fuego to New Zealand and Australia. That's a big sweep. He says, until you know them, you can't really write about varieties. Well, actually, I think that's a bit of a red herring, misleading. Darwin accepted that challenge, but he has another challenge. Because we know from the 1842 and 1844 essays that Darwin is thinking differently from Hooker about this whole question. He thinks that his theory of evolution by natural selection doesn't quite work. And why? Because the way he puts it is that there's very little variability in nature. It's an astonishing statement for Darwin. But if you read the 1842 and 44 essay, this is well established. He says there's very little variability in nature. Now, what does Darwin mean by variability? A lot of different things, including what we would today mean by variability. Genetic variability, hereditary variability. He wouldn't use the word genetic, but he would use the word heredity and hereditary. Eye color, continuous variation in height. Very little. You go out into nature, there seems to be very little, he says. But then in that essay, he also sticks in this little caveat, which I think is the clue. He says, or so the systemists say, but they never studied this. The problem that Darwin was facing was that he's trying to analyze and understand let's say, translate all of systematics, all of taxonomy, all of the tree into an evolutionary language. And all the evidence has been collected by people who believe in the fixity of species. And if you believe in the fixity of species, there's not a particular reason to look for variability. And they haven't. So when Darwin gets to the point where he is doing his barnacles, yes, he's sort of, in English we say, paying his dues, earning his spurs. He's also testing his theory on this very important point of the amount of variability in nature. I think that's what he's doing. And here's part of the evidence. I just picked this particular species, Lepus fascicularis. Look how he describes it. I mean, it's a lot of jargon, okay? But just look for the word variable. Capitulum, that's a part of this animal. Highly variable in all its characters, thick and broad in proportion to its length, but the breadth is variable. In some specimens, the capitulum being longer by 1/5 of its total length than broad. Some specimens. He's looking at multiple specimens, populations in some cases, depending on the quality of his collections. In others, 1/5 broader than longer. Valves generally approximate in some varieties. However, from the narrowness of the carina at other parts and terga, the valves stand far apart. If we actually look at his descriptions, nobody ever reads Darwin's barnacle book because it's a treatise on taxonomy. It's unreadable as a book. But nobody at the time was writing taxonomic descriptions like this. This is a model of how to do taxonomy as well as a test of the amount of variability. And what Darwin finds, going through genus after genus, species after species, in that book, you will see that he goes through maybe 40 or so species and finds variability everywhere. Omnipotent, if you like, or omnipresent variability and variation in nature. And that has a profound effect on Darwin. It has to have had a profound effect on Darwin, I suppose. Because, think about it. Natural selection, we haven't actually defined it, but it is based on hereditary variance, organisms that vary hereditarily being in competition. And if the environment favors one, that one and its progeny survive. Now, if there is very little variation in nature, natural selection is a weak force. And Darwin has a lot of history to explain with a very weak force. There is a very good reason not to publish, not to write even, The Origin of Species. This is what he's doing. He is defending that theory. The heart of his theory, the darkness at the heart of his theory is where the light is. Here's what these guys look like. Barnacles, lepus, as a matter of fact. And he's talking about these characters, the terga and whatever, the capitulum, these pieces. Oh, that's not fair. I'm going to put this back. Hopefully you can read as slowly as I do, so you didn't read that. Question now is, Darwin finishes working on the barnacles by 1846. Starts in 1846 and finishes in 1854. And you find something quite amazing. He had a little book where he kept a little diary, about this size, a little diary in which he noted important things. For example, for September 1854, he says, finished the very last proofs of my book on the cirripedes, that is the barnacles, and immediately, next line, sorted notes on species. I organized my notes on species that he had been accumulating, like the note I just showed you. And that sorting process is the beginning of the writing of The Origin of Species. It will take 5 years for it to be published, in 1859, but the writing starts when you decide to sit down, and put yourself down. And in Darwin's case, it is more notes, and it's solving problems. And the big problem is the one I've been telling you about. And certainly there are one or two others, but one of the super big problems is, how do I explain the branching tree? How do I explain the origin of species? And in his autobiography, he writes the following, about this, what's going to happen next. I can remember the very spot in the road whilst in my carriage when, to my joy, a solution occurred to me. Solution being the solution to the problem we've been talking about. And let's imagine, this is entirely fictitious, because I've been studying Darwin since 1898 or something like that, maybe 400 or 500 years. But I haven't gotten to the point where I can actually read his mind retroactively. But I don't know where that spot was, and this definitely wasn't it. This is his sand walk, the walk behind his house. If you go visit his house in Down, outside London. But you can imagine a carriage and Darwin stopping, seeing somehow the way to seize some real explanatory significance that was missing. And this is what he goes on to say. The problem was the tendency in organic beings descended from the same stock to diverge in character as they become modified. That's what we've been looking at with the Anatifera. It's implicit way back. That they have diverged greatly, goes on, is obvious from the manner in which species of all kinds can be classed under genera, genera under families, families under suborders, and so forth. Now, look at this little piece of paper. It will take a little time for it to come up because it's probably was 600 DPI. November 54, 2 months after he had started sorting his notes, we have this big rush. Many, many notes written November 54. Something happened. And they're notes on classification, on geographic distribution, on paleontology, all the subjects that are connected to divergence. How am I going to explain the separation? And look what he says. November 54. Now, see if you can follow this handwriting. We include all in class, as in crustacea. By the way, barnacles are crustaceans. He's still talking about barnacles, in a way. We include all in class, as in crustacea, which are connected, but yet no definition will define. But yet which no definition will define, a proceeding explicable on descent. Now, I want to claim for you, look carefully, that what he's writing here in 54 is basically the same thing here. This second sentence, that they have diverged greatly is obvious from the manner in which species of all kinds can be classed under genera, genera under families, families under suborders, and so forth. We include all in class, as in crustacea, which are connected, but yet which no definition will define. It's just something we get. A proceeding explicable, he should have said, only on descent. What he's grasping, and what I'm suggesting is that he's grasping it on the road, on that spot that he remembers, actually on that spot. What he's grasping is not the solution, but the problem. This is basically a restatement of the problem of diverging. And let me try to support a little bit this claim that he's really this is an event that happened to him in real life. That little piece of paper is for real. Now, this will really take a long time. But you can see what's at stake here for Darwin. Here's our little note before. And what I want to do is, here's our little picture of the kind of hypothetical place around Downhouse in his carriage. And I want to engage you in a small exercise in reading Darwin's handwriting, which, again, is a fairly challenging idea and thing to do. And here is a note which is also written in November '54. This part is in ink, this is in pencil, that's in pencil. And I'm claiming that these words are written by somebody sitting in a carriage and the road is going like that, bumpy. This is the same man writing at a desk. For example, look at the way, for example, the C is kind of diagnostic. The C in include, in class, in crustacea, it goes up and down, up and down. I can't make the movement with my pointer. Up and down. Look over here. Assuming species approximately constant. Look at that C. Round. You even corrected it. Look how this generally flows. Look at every single thing here goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And here's pencil. This is not a function of it being written in pencil, because this pencil is also, it's smaller than the ink, but it just flows. This is different. So I'm making a hard claim. I don't know why, but tonight is the night for hard claims. And so far I haven't talked about the solution. In the autobiography, the next sentence, Darwin goes on to give the solution. And the solution is, as I believe, that the modified offspring of all dominant increasing forms tend to become adapted to many and highly diversified places in the economy of nature. Darwin is bringing in the economy of nature, that is ecology, the relationships between the places, and he is developing the idea actually in this field, among other places, around Downhouse, by small experiments and also by studies of variation, like he's done on the barnacles, and studies of books of biogeography, but definitely with these small experiments, a notion that there are certain places, there's more than one place in this environment. It all looks green. But can you imagine a plant that has short roots growing in this field? Actually, the field has a name, great pucklands. A plant with short roots versus a plant with long roots. Well, Darwin will say that more life, that is, this translates almost directly into modern terms, more biomass, more amount of life, living weight of life, can be maintained in a field like that if there are diverging groups trying to occupy the same space. It's an economic, ecological vision. It comes indirectly from Adam Smith and from Henri Milne-Edwards, the division of labor that Darwin is applying, just as he had applied the economics of Malthus in the discovery of natural selection. Again, in this new form of natural selection called divergence, he's saying that there is an advantage in specialization itself, because that way more life can be sustained. There's a selective advantage in diversifying. Now, that's tricky. Now he's got selection into the branching. But it's very important that it's all happening in one field. In fact, the vision, Darwin's vision, ecological vision, or vision of nature, undergoes an amazing transformation in this 5-year period. It's out of this kind of studies of the local ecology, of population ecology, kind of Lotka and Volterra competition, that Darwin's whole concept of an entangled bank, of nature being interrelated, arises. Because he goes from discussing a 25-acre field, this field, down to doing experiments that are 3 feet by 4 feet, 2 meters by 3 meters, or something like that. Very, very focused experiments. He invents the quadrat system on his own. Others are doing it in agronomy, but not actually biologists, functioning biologists at the time, or naturalists. So in any case, his vision from being this universal to a field, to ecology, to local quadrats, local little experiments, where he will put a fence around a plot of land. Maybe it would be on the lawn of his house, not far away. And the rest of the lawn is mowed. Let's say the cows mow here in the field. Okay, but if you put a little fence around it, he finds that plants grow up, okay, obviously, but the composition of the species, which species are there, how many legumes versus how many, grasses live there, over 3 years, and he does this over a period of 3 years, 57, 58, 59, changes. A divergence, a micro-divergence, kind of a test. It all assumes something that just impossible for him to have assumed when he began. And remember where he began, his explanation of speciation, his explanation of how new species formed was by isolation. No isolation here. No geographic isolation. And he says in 1854, in one of these notes, just like the one I showed you, that, isolation is not as important as I thought it was. Now, there's a problem the biologists in the audience will see immediately with this position, because it means that a plant, 2 plants of the same species living next to each other, he's saying they can become new species. But what's going to prevent them from interbreeding and washing it away? Only one thing could do it. Selection has to be so strong. And that's what he's saying. It's just more selection. The answer to my problem of how I incorporate selection into the tree is harder and harder, more intense selection. And it's a selection because there's an advantage in the ecology. There is this entangled bank of organism connected to organism. And he also gives up at this time the idea about how variation is produced. Darwin started out with, as a chemist, a geologist, with the idea that the environment directly produces hereditary variability. Directly, it is a geochemical event. Geology, chemistry affects the biology. Completely Lamarckian. And by this period, it's the ecological relationship. It's the relationship of one organism to another that defines how they get at the geology, and how they get at the water, which is, of course, geological. No, I do not want to do that. You may want me to do that, but I'm not going to. So we have a complete transformation that's come out of this. And again, it's from these multiple sources, and it's a long period of time. People have written about why Darwin delayed in his publication. Now, there are 2 key words around this subject: delay and gap. Those are very different things. To delay, you on purpose do not publish in this case, or do not sit down to write and to publish. Well, there's a lot of evidence that Darwin delayed in that sense for cultural reasons. in his notebooks, he is going through a process of hiding how honest he can be about the metaphysical consequences of his theory. You don't know what Darwin is thinking because he commits himself not to say. He overtly says, say it that way so people won't understand, lest they think I'm an atheist. Independent of whether or not he was an atheist, he was afraid of being thought to be unrespectable person. That's delay. Gap, I think the meaning I would assign to it is there's a hole in his theory. That's a gap. And this gap of how much variability there is in nature, how do you integrate selection and the tree, after all? Now he can explain the origin of adaptation and the origin of species by one and the same theory. So he has what scientists love, a unified theory of evolution, of transmutation. And all he has to do is go through this study and write The Origin of Species. Thank you very much. Now, I understand. Have I got this on? I understand that you may have questions, so I'm going to put this headset on so that your questions can be in Italian. You can use that. Yeah. This is highly technological.
Buonasera. Volevo sapere da lei se tra i vari dubbi e o reticenze di Darwin a pubblicare l'origine della specie c'è stato o no l'influenza della teoria di Kelvin sulla possibilità che ci fosse a disposizione un tempo sufficiente in termini di storia dell'origine della Terra e del calore che la Terra è in grado di conservare nel tempo. Grazie.
Yes, well, yeah, this story about Calvin is actually from a later period. It's, Calvin has this response to Darwin, to the origin, in which, as you say, from his understanding of thermodynamics, after all, he's one of the great scientists of the time, great physicist, says there isn't enough time from the time that the Earth cooled down, central heat theory of the origin of the Earth, there is not enough time for evolution. This is something that Darwin had completely takes Darwin by surprise. He had not thought about this at all. It does not enter into his fundamental thinking of the kind of thing that I've been talking about. So it's in this post-origin, I forget the year, but it would be close to 1868 that he poses this. And Darwin has a very vague answer. He simply says, well, it's difficult for us to imagine a long number, a big number like that. How much time has passed? That's not much of an answer. Because, as I say, it's not central to his theory. And as I'm sure you're probably aware, long after Darwin's death, with the discovery of radioactivity, it was understood that the center of the Earth has radioactivity, radioactive materials and tremendous heat, and there would be enough time that was completely outside the bounds of the assumption of the Earth being this object that was cooling and cooling down. And so there was enough time. Darwin was lucky, in a sense. Yeah, but it doesn't intersect this stuff. And a lot of Darwin's answers to critiques that are interesting are things that he hasn't thought of and or doesn't have a good answer for. I think I'm of the opinion that the Darwin's Origin of Species, which goes through 6 editions in his lifetime, gets worse and worse and worse as he revises it. He's exposed in more and more places. I mean, I say worse. It's less poetic as he defends himself. That's for sure. But what the questions that get open that he can't quite answer, that he has to go back to a kind of Lamarckianism, explicit, de-emphasizing natural selection, these answers about the age of the earth. These open up the issues for the next generation. Can I call on people? This gentleman has smiled the entire time.
La mia domanda è questa: se c'è nessun riferimento nell'opera darwiniana al rapporto tra malattia e selezione naturale.
Oh yes, of course. Yes. In the very fundamental connection. When he reads Malthus on Essay on Population, which is in 1838, which is the point at which he discovers natural selection or first formulates natural selection, immediately he sees a connection to epidemics, that there could be large falls, shoots, decreases in population size or increase it because of famines and epidemics. So at that level, yes. I don't think you could give Darwin credit for the kind of selectionist medicine that we have today. That's certainly a modern development. Remember, of course, that Koch's hypothesis, the concept of microorganisms as the source of disease, not known to Darwin. It is just discovered in Darwin's lifetime. And I believe it was Ferdinand Kohn, my namesake, who visits him, actually is a friend of, a kind of a supporter of Darwin, and he begins as a botanist and goes into microbiology. That it is in his laboratory that Koch formulates his hypothesis. And Kohn brings this knowledge or this information and discusses it with Darwin when he comes to visit him in the study. But the direct application that you could have made then, as we've done with antibiotics, etc., it's become almost a commonplace, hasn't it, in modern understanding. That this is one of the real strong points of evolutionary theory, that it can explain this. Well, it's something that Darwin did not develop in great detail. I think because there's a lack of knowledge. So far we've had one problem that Darwin had to face because there was an incorrect but very authoritative piece of physics or science. And the point that you're raising, I think, a situation where there was ignorance of a different kind. There's just not enough knowledge to be able to explain disease in a really explanatory way. You can explain, Darwin is perfectly capable of explaining physiology by natural selection. He does it, for example, with his study of insectivorous plants. Aldrovandi, for example, named after a famous Italian scientist, Aldrovandi is an insectivorous plant. Indeed, Darwin explains how does this plant digest insects? Gastric juices, in humans had just been discovered, recently been discovered. And he said, it must be something like that. Applying it directly. So if the science had been there, I think that would have been a good one for him. Yes.
Sì, uno scienziato ultimamente, non mi ricordo il nome, uno scienziato ha detto l'evoluzione umana è finita. Vorrei sapere lei cosa ne pensa e poi, quindi domanda collegata, ma ci stiamo ancora evolvendo, quindi l'evoluzione umana è finita oppure no? Lei cosa ne pensa? Grazie.
Well, my answer will have to be that of a layman. My wife is an anthropologist, but and I'm a humble historian. So I, as an evolutionary biologist, I don't see how you could possibly say that. How can you possibly say that evolution has stopped? I mean, we live in a world of constant change. I don't see any biological reason. It's quite clear that culture is a, how would you put it, a force that modifies, controls a situation, an ecological situation of a unique kind that controls what the selective forces that will have a bear on biology will be. Yes, just Darwin in his, in his field, seeing the interrelations among plants. Well, we as humans have a relationship among ourselves that modifies the nature of selection. But I don't know what that man is talking or woman is talking about. I really don't. Sometimes, unfortunately, we have an expression in English in journalism that if, how does it go? Let's see. Dog bites man, no story. Man bites dog, story. So what you suggest this evolution is stopping is sort of a trope. It's a theme that recurs. But it's to get, I think it's to get attention. Of course, I'd be completely ignorant here. Maybe the person said something very intelligent. I'd be skeptical. The other thing that gets said is, along with the emphasis on the tree in the year 2009 as sort of the forefront of evolutionary biology. The other sort of other side of the coin is statements like, the best thing for evolution would be if we would kill Darwin. Like 150 years of the origin is too much already. It's somehow controlling our minds too much. That, I can tell you, is complete nonsense. Because evolutionary biology is growing and changing, and Darwin's place within it, I'm not talking about. It's different today than it was 25 years ago or 150 years ago. It's very different. we may be on the verge, or maybe some would say we're already in the middle of the neo-Lamarcko-Darwinian age. I wouldn't say it's only the Lamarckian age, but there are, first time in a very long time, serious extent, large number of evolutionary biologists are seeing the ways in which the environment can directly affect genetics through the methylation of DNA. But that view is integrated or integratable with selection. So it's not that I'm wanted in my answer to you. I don't want not like you, which I didn't answer very well, but I would not like you to see me as defending the purity and the eternity of Darwin. Far from it. Any science that stays for 150 years constant is in danger of collapse. You know, we're going to see lots of change. Yes. Buonasera.
Prima cosa, complimenti per questi eccellenti lavori che facciamo su tutto il pianeta Terra. Secondo, ho intraletto che Darwin era considerato l'anticristo. Qualche parolina per avere spiegazioni in merito. Secondo, non so se lei sa che qua in Italia noi siamo dei poverelli perché stiamo sotto l'impero clericale, per cui Darwin, cioè Giordano Bruno è stato messo sulla radicola e certamente Darwin assolutamente no, io ci metterei qualche papa. Detto questo, poi, adesso vediamo se mi ricordo. Teniamo presente che qua in Italia soltanto nel 1860, appena 150 anni fa, lei è storico, quindi mi insegna a me, io sono un modesto amante della filosofia, soltanto nel 1860 il potere papale ha perso, si fa per dire, il potere materialista. Quindi si può e poi l'attuale governo che è in carica qua in Italia ha tentato di non far insegnare le teorie di Darwin sulle scuole pubbliche italiane, la scuola media, eccetera, eccetera. Grazie, professore.
It sounds to me like you're describing the United States. We have similar problems in different dress of the political repression of this kind of science. Whether you raise a very interesting question, whether Darwin is the Antichrist, and I think the best answer is yes.
Visto che non vedo che non ci sono altre domande, approfitto di questa occasione per porgliene altre due molto veloci. Mi sembra di aver letto da qualche parte che fu fatta un'obiezione piuttosto importante a Darwin, non mi ricordo però chi è che gliela fece, che doveva passare molto tempo prima che un'espressione fenotipica vantaggiosa per la selezione naturale si realizzasse. Mano a mano che questo si realizzava in maniera molto lenta nel tempo, e gli fu obiettato che nel frattempo era difficile immaginare, prima che avesse un completo compimento questa espressione fenotipica, che ci fosse un reale vantaggio nel frattempo. Ci fu una risposta di Darwin a questa obiezione?
Well, that's a question that I might be able to answer. In part, what I have been talking about is something that Darwin himself feels. How much variability there is in nature is a function of how quickly variation can arise. Right? It's a big question mark for him, and he himself is aware of the potential difficulty. But another dimension of that question is what's called the problem of intermediates, which is a problem that Darwin himself addressed directly in The Origin of Species. The sixth chapter of The Origin of Species is called Difficulties on the Theory, and which he goes through things that he thinks are difficulties that people will possibly ask. It's the difficulties that are left, because divergence was a big difficulty that he feels he solved. Okay, but intermediates is a difficulty, and much discussion of this. Around, for example, the case of the flatfish. Right, flounders. Flatfish, yes, which live in the water, at the bottom of the ocean, and look up. And if you take them up, you see that they are not exactly bilaterally symmetrical. They don't have their eyes on both sides. And embryologically, let's say the right eye, during development, embryo goes through the brain and comes out on the other side and looks up. So, question of intermediates. How could anything survive with one eye? Go from two eyes to one eye? What are the intermediate stages? How can they be explained by your theory? And to the best of my knowledge, Darwin has a very simple answer to that, which is almost just a piece of logic, disarming piece of logic, which is something. It's a view that has retained currency to today among evolutionists, and that is that imagine the very first variation that was where there was an advantage to living on the bottom of the floor of the ocean to get more food or something like that. And so what if you didn't see with both eyes? The food is there. You have an advantage. So if you have any small advantage, any slight advantage, that will be perpetuated and grown, developed, reinforced over time. So it's just a question of the logic of the pattern of selection. And that's his answer. I think there's a certain brilliance to that, because this is where Darwin really is a Lamarckian. My professor of population biology was a gentleman, Italian professor. His name was Francesco Scudo. And he taught me in the 14th century, a long time ago, that Lamarck's basic idea is that a change in behavior comes before changes in anatomy or structure. You think about it. An animal can live in the water, at 1 foot above the floor of the ocean and be fine. but it's only a matter of changing its behavior to go down onto the side. I mean, down into the bottom. It's just a change of behavior. It just moves there. No change in biochemistry or anatomy is necessary. And then from that moment on, and a generation onwards, if that organism is successful there, then, as I was saying, evolution will reinforce that. According to Lamarck, it was acquired characteristics, or a suite of hereditary variation over a suite de génération. For Darwin, it was variation over a suite of generations by natural, subject to natural selection, but the pattern is identical. And this Darwin says, without giving Lamarck credit, in Notebook C, a few months after the famous tree was drawn. And forever he believed it. And I think that that's what most ethologists or behavioral biologists believe to be the pattern. And this really, I think this really does bear in a fundamental way on the question you're asking. Yeah. So Darwin is a Lamarckian, in the best sense. Perhaps we can go out into the night. Thank you very much.
Ringraziamo di nuovo il professor Kohn per l'intervento.